Building codes have gotten even more complex than they used to be. In the past, cities made it a little bit easier to see because of the way they regulated what the impact was going to be. They would draw a clear geographic boundary and say we have to build out of stronger, more fireproof materials in this location. And that was the era where there would be big public debates about that. Is that the right decision? Is that the right geographic area? But over time, the building codes shifted to technical formulas. And construction types are a really good example of that, rather than maps.
There's something unusual about American buildings. In most countries, structures are made out of either wood, concrete, brick, or steel. But in the US, 92% of single-family homes and 85% of multifamily buildings are made out of wood. The industry calls this Type 5 construction, and it quietly defines almost every corner of a built environment. To help us understand why this matters, we're joined by Jeana Ripple, architect, educator, and the chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Virginia. Her new book, The Type 5 City, explores how America's reliance on wood changes not just our buildings, but entire urban regions. It's a complex and fascinating story, so we split the conversation into two parts. In the first part, we focus on the buildings themselves. In part two, we zoom out on the bigger picture, how wood construction reshapes cities, neighborhoods, and the future of urban life.
Most Modern.
Well, welcome to Most Modern, Jeana.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So the main topic we're going to talk about today is the book that you wrote, The Type 5 City. To start, can you tell us what Type 5 is?
Type 5 construction, which is spelled with Roman numeral, so it looks like Type V, is one of the building code sets of rules that they use to designate what materials can be used in different locations and in different types of buildings. So they do this by classifying materials into 5 types based on how well they resist fire. So type 1 is the most fire resistant, typically made of concrete and steel. And type 5 is the least fire resistant. In the United States, that's typically made of light wood framing. And then there are in-between types, which are actually pretty interesting to look at in terms of the content of the book, because they allow for a mix. For example, type 4 is heavy timber, engineered timber, and mass timber that's becoming more popular in the United States. Or type 3, which used to be called ordinary construction, and I love that term, which was, Main Street USA, heavy fire-resistant exterior walls, often at times wood interiors.
So why write a book about Type 5? What's special about Type 5? Or did you already write 4 other books that we haven't heard about?
No. I mean, Type 5 is interesting in the United States because it's so common in cities, and that is unusual globally. In many parts of the world, cities started as wood buildings, but eventually were replaced with stronger, more fire-resistant materials like brick and stone. In Europe, for example, wood buildings are now rare in urban areas, but in the U.S., particularly as you move further west, Type 5 becomes a kind of a much more common default, even in dense areas. So I was interested in looking at how this evolved, and then also looking at this is one of the only places in the building codes where it's really trying to regulate a cumulative effect. Like urban fire was the biggest city scale risk when these codes were being developed. But it's not the only risk anymore, even though it's the only one we regulate. And we don't typically tend to look at the results at the scale of the city. So now that we have the ability to do that, I was interested to see what have we produced in this last century of cultural practices and regulations that led to a lot of Type 5 construction in the United States.
So it seems like Type 5 emerged out of a need for fire protection. When was that, and why was that?
It was the turn of the century, primarily. The Great Chicago Fire is the most famous example of when this emerged, which was 1871, at the end of 1871. And this was the moment where you can see historically that there was a big debate about whether we should prioritize kind of public safety or immediate affordability. In Chicago, they compromised and they said, well, we'll designate this one area that we'll protect. It was the business center. And then the rest of the areas are left to fend for themselves and unprotected. So different cities had different reactions to that risk. But it was absolutely the most prevalent risk at the time, at the turn of the century. As firefighting infrastructure is developed alongside cities in the United States. Some cities decided we're going to accept some of this risk and really invest in firefighting.
So one statistic in a book that really shocked me was that 92% of all new single-family homes and 85% of all new multifamily in the US is type 5. Like, what is it about type 5 that makes it just so dominant in America?
That definitely stands out globally. So it's not, there are some other parts of the world that build with wood, but not to that degree. And there are some clear benefits. So wood frame does really well in terms of cost, flexibility, and then today as a renewable resource that sequesters carbon. So it's cheaper upfront. It requires less skilled labor to build wood frame. It's flexible, especially at a smaller scale, so it's easy to build and easy to change, and it bends and moves. So in earthquake-prone areas, that's a hugely important performance factor. I could also talk about where it falls short.
Yeah, let's talk about where it falls short.
As we get denser, so especially as we get taller with wood frame buildings, that flexibility starts to decrease. So, for example, in a mid-rise structure, you need, with light wood framing, you need structural walls every 15 to 18 feet to support the building. So the idea that you might convert that to a different layout or a different use later on, that becomes less likely. And there are issues also as you get taller and denser with movement and maintenance and vulnerability. So wood, it naturally expands and contracts with changes in moisture and humidity. So in a tall wood building, 5 or 6 levels, this movement can add up and cause problems, especially when shifting areas of the building meet non-shifting areas of the building, like plumbing and windows and exterior siding. So some of those vulnerabilities can cause structural degradation or mold problems in wood frame buildings in particular.
Well, I think the interesting thing, Jeana, is that most people listening to this podcast, especially if you're in the US, are probably living in a wood frame building and probably haven't thought about that factor. Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that I think appeal domestically, like in terms of the home? And what are some of the things maybe if you grew up in America, you just haven't really noticed as shortcomings or as opportunities in type 5?
Obviously, wood frame has this it has always had this appeal. I think in the United States in particular, this was important that this was something we could interact with. There wasn't a huge barrier to be able to build yourself or to be able to make changes or make adjustments. And I think maybe in addition to not thinking about whether or not your home is built this way, we probably average Americans don't think about how much wood frame construction has changed over the last century. So, for example, if we're talking about light wood framing, 2x4s, 2x6s from the early 1900s, like, for example, the Sears catalog kit homes, those had no insulation. I mean, all wood buildings built at that time, but the kit homes give us a good example. No insulation, no moisture barriers. They were built with really dense old growth wood that naturally resisted moisture. So there might be some water that would get into those walls, but they would dry out. They wouldn't get moldy in the process. Today's light wood frame houses are built with much lighter, more porous materials because they're built usually with farmed wood that grows faster and it's younger. They rely on more layers of insulation and protection in order to keep that system performing well and keep the moisture out. And when these are all installed and maintained properly, they work really well. But wood still expands and contracts, and some of those protective layers like caulks and paints and roofing have maybe 10 to 20 year limited lifespans. So if gaps are introduced or if maintenance isn't performed regularly and water gets into this more sophisticated system, it's harder for it to dry out. It might cause more degradation or mold problems. So I kind of think of it like cars. Today's cars, they're more advanced. Today's versions are more advanced and efficient, but they're also more sensitive, and they're sometimes harder to understand and maintain than some of the traditional, simpler models.
Can you cover for us maybe a little bit of like what happens when these buildings don't get maintained and, storms where things happen? Like, what is the extent of that damage?
So if, particularly with contemporary materials, like more farmed lumber that tends to be more porous. It's more likely to warp as it gets wet and maybe fail. In addition, we use a lot of sheathing systems and cladding systems like OSB or plywood that, again, if they get wet, they're more likely to either have mold problems or even structural problems than the traditional wood boards that would have been used for exterior sheathing systems. So if that happens, it's harder to control, it's harder to repair. For example, after Hurricane Sandy, residents talked about what they started to term the Sandy cough, because it was so difficult to get rid of. Once water got into those wall systems, it was really so difficult for them to find a way to remediate.
And the sandy cough is caused by like mold and things like growing in these cavities that we just...
Exactly. You can't see it. It's harder to get rid of it once it's in there.
If I'm like the average American consumer and I'm looking for a home, maybe looking for a place to rent, or even just like at Home Depot looking at building materials, like what are some signs and things that I should be looking for to know whether or not I'm about to get myself into a sandy cough situation?
Right. Well, I think if most of us do live in wood frame homes, or we are at least having to make choices as consumers about whether we are going to buy a wood frame home or add on with wood framing. And I think it's smart to understand how long different building components are expected to last. So there's an International Association of Home Inspectors that actually publishes a list of various building material types and components and their typical lifespan or warranty. So this can be a way to kind of anticipate, these are the parts of the home I might need to pay attention to at certain time frames or invest in. And also pay attention to your local climate. So if you live in an area with a lot of rain or flooding problems in particular, or threats of windstorms, wood systems can be more vulnerable to damage. And so those kind of moisture sensitive materials will require more upkeep. I think one of the trickiest situations is for those of us living in multifamily, say mid-rise structures, particularly if you're considering purchasing something like a condo. I think you'll want to ask a lot of questions about what's behind the walls, what's the structure? Is it wood frame? Is it metal frame? Is it concrete and steel? And if it is wood, what are the maintenance processes to kind of check the integrity of the envelope, or how are costs for maintenance factored into condo association fees?
Yeah, it's just something you don't really see on Zillow. It's not like, 2 bedrooms,
No.
2 baths, wood frame or steel or
No,
concrete.
it's difficult. You can find it sometimes on Zillow. Sometimes it is, the city assessors will sometimes include exterior wall material, but some of it can be a little bit ambiguous.
There's definitely a friction between, and I think we'll get to it, the market and the material. And I think what we're seeing playing out right now is maybe the market is so high, right? It's so hard to get housing right now, but the materials are degrading. And like you say, Jeana, a lot of these buildings don't last as long as if they were built in a different material, if they're in wood particularly.
It's a challenge. It's interesting to also think about, like, why is this kind of low skilled labor assembly actually producing, helping us be more productive with construction, or is it actually slowing us down?
Right,
We
yeah.
now have a lot of different trades involved in the production of one wall assembly with a lot of different layers, and it at a certain point it makes me wonder if that's part of the problem rather than actually contributing to the solution.
I think that's quite interesting because I think reading the book, one of the things that made, I guess, Type 5 very American is that you could build your home yourself. Like you mentioned the Sears catalog, as America expanded west, it was kind of this feeling of autonomy, this feeling of agency, this like very hoorah, like we can do this ourselves. But now hearing you talk about, hey, like now a single wall assembly takes all of these trades, it's kind of that agency, that autonomy getting taken away. So like what happened through this evolution where this material was this, this material was a way for people to have much higher agency over their homes, to now where not only do we have this material, something that we maybe don't even have a choice over.
I think it's mostly focus on upfront costs and operational costs. So the sort of what's the upfront cost to make it, not necessarily how long is it going to last. I think the average turnover of American homes is something like 7 years. So if we're only occupying any given home for 7 years, maybe we're more prone to think in these short-term, immediate return type of investments. And then even recently, there's been so much focus on performance in terms of just operational energy. So that's where you get into a situation where like we're really concerned about improving the technology of the insulation, maybe less concerned about how that's adding complexity to the system and maybe decreasing the kind of overall productivity of construction as an industry.
To Levo's point, like you and I can go down to Home Depot, we can buy a bunch of measured wood and we can start building a house right now, although we understand it's much more complex than that. I'm curious, actually, the sort of origin of a lot of this wood. There's maybe an argument that if it's sourced from nearby, it's more locally produced, it's beneficial, or especially now with sort of onshoring of materials, that becomes a more political and economic problem. Buildings that are built in America, are they sourced from wood from America, or does that wood come from somewhere else?
It's a really good question. I was curious about that when I started some of this research, and a student that was working with me, I asked her to start calling lumber yards and just asking what kind of wood do they sell? Is it southern yellow pine? Is it Douglas fir that's typically from the Pacific Northwest? And that they could answer very quickly. There were clear kind of cultural preferences among local building industries, local contractors. But then if we asked where the wood came from, the answer we sometimes got was from the delivery truck. And it's not always an obvious pattern. There were preferences for southern yellow pine in Chicago, but Douglas fir in New York. The geographies were not always easy to predict either. The huge majority of the U.S. lumber is sourced from the Pacific Northwest. Canada actually is a lot of the lumber source, and also around the kind of Northwest United States. There is some slight shift that we're seeing related to climate change, that there's more effect on the level of productivity. The northern species is going slightly down. Forest fires contribute to that. The level of productivity and investment is going slightly up in southern areas, and that is anticipated to change. Like the geographies of these species, people say, may move north. So that may kind of affect how this industry evolves.
The wood that is building buildings in North America primarily comes from North America. It's not being shipped in from other places.
Primarily it comes from North America. Yeah.
Are all these species like the same and it just comes down to local preference, or are there like significant differences between what you pick and what your walls are made out of?
There are some defaults that are most common, and they have a lot of kind of similar performance characteristics in terms of structure. Surveys of contractors tend to see that more of them don't like the southern species. They think they warp more. I think they're less kind of dimensionally stable. It's I don't know that that's been confirmed through testing at a rigorous level, but there's a huge difference in the number of defaults in the United States versus some other countries that tend to rely on wood. For example, in Australia, there's a very long list of naturally durable wood species, and they kind of tie those durability characteristics to climate zones. So let's say a species that's naturally resistant to termites, they'll say, this is appropriate in this area. In the United States, we tend to default to chemical treatments. We have a few default wood types, and where there are vulnerabilities, it's the chemical treatments are the default way to deal with that.
As an architect, is this something that you are highly concerned about if you're going to build a building? Are you thinking about the exact wood material, or is it just like, okay, it's going to be wood frame construction, I'll let the contractor or the engineers figure that out?
I think I'm most concerned with is, depending on the scale of the project, could we find a way to build out of something that's going to allow for more spatial flexibility over time, maybe avoid some of the kind of inherent vulnerabilities of light wood framing. So not so much which wood out of the choices that are common in the United States, although it would be great to, in a flood-prone area, I think that would be a different conversation. But are there ways to think about longer span systems like these mass timber systems that might allow the structure to be more adaptable over time and more resilient.
Mass timber is something we talk about a lot. It's becoming more and more popular, I think, within the last 5 years. Is the industry starting to shift that way, or are you fighting kind of this uphill battle right now against that 95% Type 5?
I think you're still fighting an upfront battle. You think about these building components right now, they're only regulated in terms of fire protection. If we started to think about regulating them in terms of longevity, like these portions of the building need to, should be built to last a longer period of time, or should be built to allow for different uses over time. That would be an interesting alternative model to consider.
And by the way, who is regulating them? Who is the organizing body that decides type 1 through 5 and what we can use them for?
So there are national model codes that are produced through a public-private partnership. So policymakers, but also a lot of sometimes kind of a criticized level of industry influence from product manufacturers, home builders associations, et cetera. But ultimately, states and cities have a lot of control over whether or not and what components of these model codes they choose to adopt. So states are the ones who determine what is the default code, and cities can expand upon that or make it more stringent in certain ways. Typically, whether they have capacity to really analyze that and kind of have that public discourse, I think is another issue.
And I just want to clarify, building code is not the same as zoning code, right?
Correct. So zoning code controls typically land use, what kinds of uses can exist in certain places in the city. Building codes tend to control the kind of at the scale of the building, how it's has structural integrity, what material is allowable based on the use of the building, how much light and ventilation and waterproofing is included, things like that. But the two work in tandem, so they certainly have an influence on each other.
They're not regulated in tandem. It's not the same group of people that are deciding zoning versus building
Right.
code.
States tend to relinquish that authority to the local municipalities, which of course allows for a different level of local participation in those decisions.
Local participation, I think, is another piece of insight that really surprised me in the book. The opacity of this regulation just really prevents the average person from influencing or understanding what's happening to the cities. So I guess from your perspective, what makes building code and zoning so opaque, and is it intentionally that way?
Building codes have gotten even more complex than they used to be. In the past, cities made it a little bit easier to see because of the way they regulated what the impact was going to be. For example, they would draw a clear geographic boundary and say we have to build out of stronger, more fireproof materials in this location. And that was the era where there would be big public debates about that. Is that the right decision? Is that the right geographic area? But over time, the building codes shifted to technical formulas, and construction types are a really good example of that rather than maps. So that made the rules harder to understand. In addition to just the kind of opaque nature of the building codes, I think understanding what that produces, the insight into that was really not publicly available for most of the 20th century. Fire insurance companies had mapped that overall city scale impact and looked at it. Mortgage lenders, famously the redlining maps were looking at building material, but the average person didn't have access to that information until, kind of late in the 20th century when some of that became public. So I think it's a combination of very complex rules and then lack of ability to even visualize how that cumulatively impacts a city.
Yeah, just building off that, I think one of the common threads in a lot of our conversations on the show is that people feel like despite the fact that they have to occupy the physical environment, they have less and less agency or even just less and less understanding about why something is a certain way. And it feels like Type 5 is a perfect example of just take it for granted. Most buildings that we inhabit are going to be built out of wood. Most buildings that we're going to build in the future are going to be built out of wood in this country, at least. It's really helpful to start to understand this aspect of things. We've had people talk about zoning, for instance, and if you want to upzone, if you want to build taller, you might have to consider changing the type of building that you're building.
Mm-hmm. And even if you want to see different types of occupancy opportunities in your neighborhood, you might have to think about, well, if we need to make it specifically require more robust construction, or more robust construction combined with smaller kind of rentable sizes of entrepreneurial units. So I think, like zoning, it's not a question of like there's ultimately a good way to build and a bad way to build, but there are different ways we should think about prioritizing in different parts of the city, or based on kind of the objectives of that community.
I think we'll get to the sort of context part in a second, but there's one last aspect of the actual building that I want to touch on, which is the construction part. Like, can you talk us through how you actually build a Type 5 building relative to maybe a more complex or more robust construction type? And then also, how does the construction industry play a role in this? Because as we know, these are big corporations building large groups of homes, often suburban kind of sprawl, in this sort of cookie cutter rinse and repeat method. How does that factor into this culture of building in Type 5?
Typically, you start with a kind of very similar foundation, regardless of what is going on top. So you'll need a kind of concrete foundation to even a wood building. At the scale of a multifamily unit, sometimes that concrete foundation is actually what's called a podium, like retail space or parking space with a kind of more robust construction system. And then at the upper levels of a wood frame, single family house or even multifamily, you are taking small sticks, aggregating them in order to create a structural wall and roof assembly. In contemporary model codes in this country, we are allowed to build that up to about the 60-foot height limit in most places, or 5 or 6 stories of stacked wood construction if they have certain occupancy and certain sprinkler systems. After you build the basic structure, you're going to come in and add a kind of what's called a sheathing, which is an outer layer, which also typically includes some sort of vapor barrier or moisture barrier at that outer level. And then you're going to add what's called a cladding, which kind of protects, it doesn't provide the moisture barrier, but it provides a little bit of weathering protection on the outer level of the building. And you're going to add interior layers like insulation inside that cavity wall, drywall, other kind of finished carpentry. In other forms of construction, the kind of traditional masonry only wall, you might have it's really kind of one system. It's just the mason. It's just the masonry. It was often uninsulated. Contemporary versions of either masonry or concrete construction are going to involve similar, like a layering of some of that insulation and some of that cladding as well.
So you mentioned a lot of like vapor barriers, like cladding, these like technologies that emerged to maybe alleviate some of the risks of Type 5 construction. Like, have we gotten to a point where we have scienced Type 5 to a place where it's no longer as vulnerable, or do these vulnerabilities still exist despite all the technology we've come up with?
We have created a good system if there are no mistakes, or whether mistakes in the construction process or mistakes that, just weathering might produce and wear and tear might produce over time. And when those gaps or, errors occur in Type 5 construction, it can cause more harm than with some of the other more robust systems that are less prone to things like water infiltration. I think in storm and flood prone areas, the kind of inherent more fragile kit of parts is something to look carefully at. So we mentioned Sandy Cough, but in addition, the analyses that the city of New York did after Hurricane Sandy found that overwhelmingly the damage after that storm was to Type 5 buildings. Even though many different types of buildings were hit, they saw more significant damage by far in the Type 5 buildings.
So we're starting to kind of move out of the building scale, kind of into the urban scale. But before we get to that part of the conversation, as say like an average citizen or an average homeowner, what is maybe 1 or 2 pieces of insight that I should take away from this conversation to help me make better decisions?
Asking questions, looking at material as maybe a factor in market decisions, and thinking about, not that, necessarily everyone has the luxury to choose where they're going to live based only on material, but that might be one factor, and that maintenance is part of that equation. That, maybe we take more risk in choosing a more vulnerable system, but then we know we're going to have to allocate some of our budget to maintenance in order to keep that a kind of healthy, safe place to live. And, maybe some of that attention will also start to impact the market. I think the fact that these questions aren't asked very often, absolutely, like, we relinquish any control over the system if we don't even pay attention to it.
So ask more questions of, your realtor, your contractor, and as we shift this conversation of your local politician, right?
Yep, absolutely.
We hope you've enjoyed part 1 of our conversation with Jeana on Type 5. If you're looking for part 2, click right here.